Chapter 12. The excitement over Mr. Lipper's murder started to die down. Despite its bizarre nature, no one seemed to really care about the death of a mean old man who was socially inept. The most interesting aspect of the case was that it happened behind the house of a well-known author, in the very same woods where other deaths had occurred. Investigators were having difficulty solving the supposed murder. Jordan shuddered to think he may have seen Mr. Lipper, or the murderer, in the woods that night. Surprisingly, he felt absolutely no guilt. It's not like he could have saved the old man. Or could he have? If the murderer had been the Texas Devil, then no. The devil was a monster, one that didn't kill like an animal. It killed like a homicidal maniac. Jordan wasn't even sure where the idea of the monster came from, but once the notion was out there, it spread like wildfire. He was constantly on alert while at school, fearful that he would run into Deirdre again. After her awkward encounter with Dad a week ago, Jordan was worried the reporter would try to get answers through him once again. He decided he would refrain from speaking to her, even if it made his family look suspicious. He wasn't sure why they would look guilty, however. None of the Scotts had killed Mr. Lipper. Jordan had been asleep in the house. Connor had been passed out in their tent. Dad had been out of town. That only left Aaron and Travis. Aaron said she'd gone back to Travis's car, so there was no one to account for the bad boyfriend's whereabouts at the time. Though Jordan didn't like him, he couldn't see Travis killing anyone. Thinking of that brought something to Jordan's mind. Why didn't the murderer kill Connor and Travis? They had been only yards away from the stream. And what had that hole been for? Jordan wondered if someone had planned on burying something in it. He did get a strange feeling when he first saw it, something familiar, but he couldn't remember what. The answer was just at the tip of his brain, teasing him. It became infuriating. Deirdre sat at her desk in her bedroom, poring over her research. She didn't have much. Before Don Scott became a popular author, his life had seemed anything but normal. There wasn't much, but what was there proved significant. His mother, Hilda, died in Georgia, shot to death by her husband Patrick. Hilda, however, had not been entirely innocent. She had supposedly killed her boyfriend, Adrian, and buried his body at the very spot where she lost her own life. That definitely raised an eyebrow. Don's father died of a heart attack here in Texas. Don had been at the scene. His brother, Ethan, had been shot to death in a robbery in his girlfriend's home, which was in the same neighborhood where his mother died. Not only that, but the same house would host another murder, that of Ivy's last boyfriend 10 years ago. Very interesting. Ethan's murderer was never caught, and Don's whereabouts for that night were still unknown. Don stood at the kitchen counter, marinating chicken for dinner. He stared out the window directly in front of him, which gave him a view of the side of Mr. Lepper's house. Just thinking about what happened to that man filled him with dread. Don knew the Texas Devil had nothing to do with the murder. He also knew he didn't kill his neighbor. He would have remembered that. Besides, he had been far away from here at the time, not in New York with his agent like he'd told the boys. He may not have been where he said he was, but he knew for a fact he didn't kill his neighbor. The curse hadn't taken hold. Don suspected, from the deepest level of his being, that Mr. Lepper had been killed by one of the boys. The Scott family sat down to dinner later that day. The house was so quiet without Samantha running her mouth and blaring her pop music. Jordan almost missed her simply because he couldn't stand this new silence. Dad sat across from him, with Connor next to Jordan. The boys stared at Dad, and he stared back. Jordan grew nervous. So far, Dad hadn't said much about the boys camping in the woods without his permission. Dad didn't look angry, though. He looked worried. "I'm sorry you boys have to go through all this," Dad finally said, breaking that terrible silence. "It must have been scary, seeing a dead body like that." "It wasn't that bad," Connor said casually as he chewed his chicken. Dad ignored him and said, "You boys know you shouldn't have been in those woods to begin with." "We know, Dad," Jordan replied. "Why did you do it then?" Jordan looked at his cousin. It had all been Connor's idea, after all. He should be the one to explain. Connor noticed his cousin eyeballing him, swallowed his food audibly, and then told Dad, "It seemed like a cool idea." The house grew silent once again as Dad processed that response. Jordan held his breath. Connor had always been a thorn in Dad's side, constantly getting into trouble. Jordan wondered if the breaking point had finally been reached. Dad's face contorted, like he was holding something in, and then, suddenly, he laughed. Connor began laughing as well. Jordan couldn't understand what was happening. He wasn't in the laughing mood himself, so he simply sat there with his foolish family. Monica Scott was exhausted when she walked into her empty house. Her nurse scrubs hung loosely on her dwindling frame as she walked into her kitchen and began heating up the lasagna Terry had made her last night. Terry, that poor lovely man, was a fool for putting up with her. He gave his heart to her ceaselessly, but she only managed to accept it with reluctance. In truth, she missed Donovan. She missed her son as well. She missed her world. Not a day went by that she didn't think of Dawn and Jordan, and she spent equal amounts of time regretting her horrible decision to leave them. She'd let fear of the unknown break up her family. That wasn't like her. She had been a strong woman, and yet Dawn's terrible secret had filled her with an unbearable dread. That dread had haunted her dreams and her waking thoughts, had consumed her. She'd felt the only escape was to distance herself from the source, Dawn. Just knowing that the curse had been imprinted onto her son as well only fueled her fear. But she couldn't stay away from her baby. She saw him every summer, and she sensed something in him, just beneath the skin. Whatever it was never managed to surface, however, and for that she was grateful. As she ate the lasagna at the table, she remembered Dawn as he had been. That cute little boy with the undeniable crush on her in grade school. Monica missed him terribly at that moment. She'd read all of his books over the years, disposable thrillers only decently written, and she watched the few interviews he'd ever done. Time hadn't been kind to him. He now seemed like a mere shadow of his former self. She wished things could go back to the way they were, but Ethan's murder, nothing could undo that. No matter how much she wished and prayed, nothing could change the fact that Don had killed his own brother in cold blood. Monica listened to the messages on her answering machine. One was from Terry, stating he couldn't get her on her cell, but left a voicemail, which she would check later. Another message was from a woman who left no name, but asked her how she felt about the murder that had taken place behind Dawn's house. Monica gasped and listened to the message again. She couldn't have heard properly. The voice had sounded casual, like a friend merely being curious. Monica called Dawn's cell phone, praying he answered. While she waited, she booted up her computer in the bedroom. "Hello?" Dawn's voice answered after 1,000 rings.
"Dawn, why didn't you tell me someone was murdered behind your house?"
Monica was suddenly angry and could not keep the heat from her voice. "How did you find out about that?" he asked.
"It doesn't matter. Why didn't you tell me?"
"Calm down, Monica. Nobody was murdered. My neighbor fell into a hole upside down." Monica pulled up the story online, read it to herself.
"The news said he was buried upside down. I hardly call that an accident."
Dawn was speechless for a moment. Monica held her breath and waited. He was clearly trying to come up with a response, which told her that he had something to hide. Finally, he said, "There's nothing to worry about."
"I beg to differ."
"I'm handling it."
"What's going on over there, Donovan?"
After a breath, she at last voiced her concern.
"Did you do it?"
"No," he answered at once. "I was out of town, and I would have remembered." There was another concern, however.
"Did one of the boys do it?"
The words tasted awful in her mouth, and she hated herself for even asking. Her concern was made worse when Dawn said, "I don't know yet."